parts, but maybe we could do that too. There'll be breaks in. Okay. Okay. Okay, sounds good. Parts, but
Okay. Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to today's webinar. My name is Kabir, and I'm with Lever Research Group. I will be your host today. Today, we have Sean Elgar. He will be talking about dugouts for agriculture and other rural uses. Before we dive in, I'd like to cover a few housekeeping items. If you have any questions during the presentation, please hold them until the very end. We will have 15 minutes for Q&A session. However, if something urgent comes up and you need my help during the webinar, feel free to type in the chat section. I will be keeping an eye toward the session. Without further ado, let's begin the webinar. Over to you.
okay. Just a sound check. Can people hear me
Yeah.
on the meeting in the meeting?
Yes.
You want to? Okay, very good. I don't know if you could hear Kabir, but I couldn't hear him, so a little bit of audio technical difficulty here. But thank you, Kabir, for hosting this and organizing it. It's always great to have, these types of events. I'll be talking about dugouts for livestock and rural usage. This is in two parts. I'll give the agenda for the second part later on. And yeah, dugouts are a hot topic. We've been getting a lot of calls over the last while. I mean, we had 3 years of drought. We had this last snowfall, which was good. And it varies in areas of the province, but a lot of the snow sank into the ground and not much water ran off into dugouts in a lot of areas in Alberta. Some areas were better than others. But yeah, it's I don't have to, talk to people about planning ahead for drought anymore because they're calling us and some of them are in dire needs. And yeah, so my name is Sean Elgert. I'm an agricultural water engineer. I'm based out of Barrhead, but I take calls from all over the province. And I deal with water wells, dugouts, pipelines, spring developments, dams. Not a lot of dams. We don't see a lot of those anymore. And also I help with water quality suitability assessment and treatment, and other issues as well. But you can phone 310 Farm and ask for advice on those topics. I'm one of the water specialists that are available. And we have a couple of people that have left us. One is retiring now, and the other left us earlier. So we have some new people on board as well, to replace some of them. And yes, so I'll get into the agenda here. I'll give an introduction and I'll talk about planning, then the Sustainable Canadian Agricultural Partnership Water Program, then design, construction, and operating systems. I hear this saying often, or I've heard it in the past, a few people have mentioned, well, a dugout's just a hole in the ground. Actually, it's not just a hole in the ground. It can be more challenging than a well, maybe not in construction, but there's certainly construction aspects that need to be considered, but it can have variable water quality and it's influenced more from outside sources. So a flock of geese could come by, wildlife, or cattle, if there are cattle around the dugout, can present water quality problems, and can vary from time to time. Also, contractors vary in quality. So you want to find a contractor that's experienced and has a good reputation. Various uses require specific design and operation. So these uses can include livestock, aquaculture, pesticide spray mixing, irrigation, aesthetic and recreational uses. And I this is coming into mind of a lot of people lately, firefighting, because I mean we've seen a lot of fires around. And so you might want to think about extra storage in that case. And also people do use it for domestic usage. I don't advise drinking that even with treatment because it's very difficult to operate a treatment system for drinking surface water. But people do use it for household, especially where water well is not available or groundwater is not available. Everyone's favorite topic, regulations. Alberta Environment and Protected Areas, or EPA, has the regulatory jurisdiction with these regulations. And there are two main aspects of regulatory issues for surface water or groundwater. The two main aspects is an approval and a license. So an approval is required to construct the works in some cases, and I'll go over some of the details of those cases. Also, a license is required for very large dugouts. Mostly the term license is referring to the use of the water. So also for dugouts, if you have a large annual withdrawal, and I'll go over the details of that amount, you need a license. And when we talk about license for water wells, we're talking about the use of the water, just as an example of what a license means. The ownership of the water is vested in the Crown. So the people, even if the water is on their land, they don't own the land. So the Crown does so that they can protect the water sources for all Albertans. So an approval is required if for a surface runoff filled dugout, if the dugout is over 2,500 cubic meters or 550,000 imperial gallons constructed size. An example of this, and you can come up with different configurations, but is 175 feet by 75 feet, 70 feet wide by 13 feet deep, with slopes of 2 to 1 all the way around. Again, you can select different slopes, and I often recommend different than that. Also, an approval is required if it's located in a watercourse with fish, in a lake or a wetland subject to the Water Act. If it's in a more valuable wetland, you have to complete a wetland assessment and pay compensation to restore a wetland in another area. So overall, wetlands aren't being lost. It's an effort that the government is strongly tried to uh, um, put into effect to preserve the overall amount of wetlands in Alberta because they're very important. Also, if you are going to build a new dugout in the same water course and parcel of land as an existing dugout, you need an approval for that. I'm not going to read anything off this. I just want to show you that there's a fact sheet called the Water Act, and I can't see because it's being hid. Oh, yeah, Water Act Dugouts fact sheet online. And I sent Kabir some links before the meeting. Hopefully he'll be able to send these links out, the reference links. Maybe Kabir, if you could just post in chat if you're able to do that or not. Or you could always contact 310 Farm and ask for some of these references. Many people often don't understand what a wetland is. It's a very important and involved question. What is a wetland? Well, the Alberta Wetland Policy defines a wetland as land saturated with water long enough to promote wetland or aquatic processes, as indicated by the poorly drained soils, hydrophytic vegetation, and various kinds of biological activity that are adapted to a wet environment. So hydrophytic vegetation obviously means water-loving vegetation, vegetation that grows in wetter conditions. There are 4 levels of value assigned to wetlands: A, B, C, and D. D is the lowest value of a wetland, and you will likely have a much easier time getting approval to dig in a level D wetland. There are 5 classes of wetlands in Canada: bog, fen, marsh, swamp, and shallow water. An approval and licensing is also based on the type of usage. And this is required for aquaculture, commercial uses, municipal uses, tank loading facilities, and irrigation. Well, a lot of people aren't, the farmers are not going to fit into those categories. Maybe some of them, but A license is required for dugouts with a volume greater than 12,500 cubic meters or 2.75 million imperial gallons. That's a large dugout. And an example of that is 300 feet by 127 feet wide by 18 feet deep with 2-to-1 slopes all the way around. Again, normally slopes have a different configuration. I just give this as an example. Also, if you withdraw annually 6,250 cubic meters or 1.375 million imperial gallons, you need a license for that. That's half the amount of the constructed volume that I just mentioned. Also, the Minister of EPA or Director has discretional power under Section 35 of the Water Act for certain cases. For example, in the South Saskatchewan River Basin, there are restrictions for some runoff-filled dugouts. Moving on to siting, you want to site a dugout in a low area for runoff capture or near a waterway, but you want to avoid valuable wetlands. And also the dugout should fill 8 out of every 10 years to be feasible. You don't want to be out of water come a time of drought. Also, you want it in an open area where you have natural aeration and no debris falling into the dugout from the trees. Here in the schematic, I just want to talk mainly about the right-hand column. On the top right, you'll see a dugout in a watercourse. As the water travels down the waterway, it picks up sediments, which carry nutrients, and when it hits a dugout in a waterway, they all fall out, and they provide nutrients for the growth of harmful or problematic growths in the dugout and other quality problems as well. So you don't want to do that. Also in the bottom right, I'll talk about this later. You want to avoid digging in the water table or an aquifer. And I'll talk about that in more detail. You want to avoid locating dugouts close to manure storage areas, animal confinement areas, waste disposal sites, pesticide, fertilizer, and fuel storage areas, septic fields and septic tanks, saline seeps. As far as trees go, the leaves, twigs, and roots can fall into the dugout, causing quality problems. And the wind also, it prevents natural aeration, which you want to have your dugout water aerated. For deciduous trees, you should keep them back 50 meters, and for coniferous trees, you should keep them back 20 meters. Here are some examples of poor siting. In the bottom left, you can see the trees are very close at the dugout. The twigs and leaves and even some of the trees are falling into the dugout. So these leaves and whatnot dissolve over time, and they end up as dissolved organic matter in the dugout. And you can see the dugout water is very dark. That's because of the organic matter that is dissolved into the dugout. Also, it prevents natural aeration. In the picture on the right, you can sort of see well, you may not be able to see, but there's a yard in the background and also a cultivated area. So nutrients from the yard and the cultivated area can end up in the dugout. And you may be able to see that there is actually blue-green algae growing in the dugout, which I'll talk about later on. As far as the desired location goes, you want it close to where you're going to use the water. Close to a dependable electrical power is preferable. I mean, if you have windmill aeration, if it stops blowing, it takes a long time to get oxygen back into the dugout. Also, tree stands can help trap the snow. Again, not too close to the dugout. And you also want it near other water sources so you can have more management options for your water. As far as the catchment area goes, you want to have grass waterways and vegetative filter strips to filter out that sediment that carry the nutrients into the dugouts, and maintain good cropping practices and have access for maintenance, repair, and monitoring for the dugout. So one of the first things you should do is do a water needs assessment. And I'm just talking about one dugout in particular. You can do it for the whole farm, but you want to know how much water you need to be using for that dugout. So we do have a calculator to help assess your annual water requirements on the open government website called Average Daily and Annual Water Requirements. And I see Kabir said he can send these links out later. So this is one of the links that you will receive. Here's some examples, just a few. Cow-calf pair, 12 imperial gallons per day per pair. Dairy cows, 30 imperial gallons. Swines, for sows, 20 imperial gallons. And there are, different weights of cattle that we have numbers for in the tool. And you should also consider other uses. Spray water for crops is getting a little more popular these days. Years ago, they didn't like it because it would plug the emitters. The surface water would have particles, but there are filtration systems available, and well water can produce problems for spray water, making it less efficacious, less effective. So yeah, you should consider using dugouts for spray water. Also, fire protection, as I mentioned, and garden watering. You can add all those numbers in. I want to just talk a little bit about our water program. Under the Sustainable Canadian Agricultural Partnership, we do have a water program that's available for agricultural producers. I work in the on-farm water supply stream, not the climate change and environment one. So I'm going to talk about that on-farm water one in this few slides. The purpose of the program is to support better management of risks to water quality and supplies and adaptation to climate variability, and to support agricultural producers in securing, protecting, and managing sustainable constructed water sources. Eligible applicants include agricultural producers with at least $25,000 worth of farm commodities annually and are liable to pay Alberta income tax or corporate tax on income from the production of farm commodities. So example of farm commodities would be selling cattle or selling hay or grains or oilseeds. Also, Indigenous applicants are eligible. Under the eligible activities, we have both standard incentives, for example, wells, dugouts, pipelines, dams. These are unshared pipelines, by the way. And there are also potential funding for components of shared pipelines as well. We also have special incentives, for example, plugging wells, well pit conversions, and there are different levels or maxims that we pay on for these projects. I want to especially point out the projects that include dugouts, dams, and spring developments, because an applicant has to speak to an agricultural and irrigation water specialist, such as myself, and receive a signed construction sheet prior to constructing these projects to confirm, and also to confirm the proposed project meets legislative and program requirements. So yeah, these are the only projects under the water program that require this paperwork to be done ahead of time. And so for these standard incentive projects, the cost share is 50% grant, 50% applicants. So the government pays 50% of eligible costs up to, for one project, up to a maximum of 10,000, but we have two lumps of $10,000. And there are further details on our funding list, which should be one of the links that is sent out to you if you haven't already seen our program. So now I want to talk about drought proofing a dugout. Some people think that our water program, the funding program, requires too large of a dugout. Not everyone, especially nowadays, people want to be building larger dugouts because of the dry conditions they've had, so that when there's more intensive flooding, they capture that, the more runoff, so it'll last through a period of drought, hopefully. Often people don't realize that a 2-year drought-sized dugout is much larger than they were wanting to build. And for this drought proofing, you can call 310 Farm and ask for a water specialist for drought sizing assistance. But we do have a quality farm dugouts manual that has all of the steps on how to go through a drought proof sizing of a dugout. I say drought proof, it is not assured that you're going to survive through drought, depending on the conditions. Heat can evaporate water quite quickly if we get hot conditions, but this is a step towards the drought proofing. So here in our schematic, we see at the start of the first year, fingers crossed, our dugout is full of water after the spring runoff. That's on a good flow year, maybe. And then during that year, we have evaporation loss and water use during the first year. And then that cycle occurs the second year again. And then at the end of the second year, if you're winter watering, there will be water tied up in the ice that you might want to consider also. So at the start of the third year, you'll have water still available. And there's also dead storage um, that is included in these calculations. So I recently redid calculations for based on the meteorological data and also a method of calculating based on slopes, since slopes are important for evaporation. So it includes the dead storage as well and more recent meteorological data. But things are changing. You know, what used to be a 1 in 50 year event isn't anymore. So the first step is to calculate your annual needs, as I mentioned before. I'm just going to use for this example, a simple example of 50 cow-calf pairs for 6 months. We take our 50 cow-calf pairs, multiply it by the 12 imperial gallons per day per pair that they use by the 180 days, and we get that you need 108,000 imperial gallons annual usage. Then the next step is to find the evaporation zone you're in. I'm just going to flip to the zone here. For the Battle River area is zone 2, not the highest evaporation, but the mid-range. And so I'm going to use calculations from zone 2. The next step is to choose your slopes, because as I mentioned, the slopes are important for evaporation. The flatter the slopes, the more evaporation you're going to have, because the surface area to volume ratio is larger. And so you're going to choose your slopes, and then in this method from charts, we're going to find the ratio of annual usage. So just to start off with, obviously the ratio of annual usage for 2 year drought supply is going to be at least 2 times your annual usage, but it's going to be 2 years of evaporation, and also to count for the dead loss use on the bottom. So we're in this example, I'm going to use 4:1 end slopes and 1.5:1 side slopes, though I usually recommend a different configuration, which I'll talk about later. And I'm going to flip to the chart here and then come back to the slide. So here with this 4:1 end slope and 1.5:1 side slope configuration that I've circled in red there, we go to that chart and we see that for our 100,000 imperial gallon usage, which is 0.1 million imperial gallons, we see that in zone 2, we require 4.1 times annual usage. That might be more than you were thinking. And so then we multiply our annual usage times that ratio, when we get that we need a dugout the size of just over 440,000 imperial gallons, which happens to be the standard minimum size under our water program that we require. And I chose this number for that reason. And again, so that accounts for all of those uses and losses. Now, once you know the volume of the dugout you need, you can then determine the rest of the dimensions. We already chose the slopes. Now we're going to solve for the top length, width, and the depth of the dugout. We have a calculator on the internet called the Dugout Lagoon Volume Calculator, and this will be one of the references that will be sent to you by email. And so here we see in the top picture, zero vertical slopes have 100% failure rate. They're sloughing in there, as you can see. In years ago, like I was hired from Manitoba to come back to Alberta during the 2000 and on drought, and there were a lot of people digging dugouts very quickly, and you know, there were a number of dugouts that were not constructed very carefully, and this is one of the examples of that time. There were, in 2.5 years, there were over 5,000 applications for water sources during that drought. So people were, just going fast and hard working on these water resources. Here we can see a nicely constructed dugout in the bottom right. You can see the slopes there. These are 1.5:1 slopes. They're steeper. It's the steepest we allow under our funding program, but if it's in a heavy clay, it will be stable. So if you have steeper slopes, this can provide some weed control. It will reduce evaporation. and also promotes a cooler and better quality water. If the water's cooler, then it's generally better quality as well. But you don't want it too steep so as to prevent sloughing. So commonly recommended are side slopes of 1.5 to 1 and end slopes of 4 to 1. I most often recommend just one end at 4 to 1 and all the other slopes at 1.5 to 1. You can fence it off and have a gate open on the 4 to 1 and so the cattle can get in and out for a drink of water. But you also want a bottom width of at least 10 feet because when the dugout has sediment fall into it and the plants that die off and fall to the bottom, you can lose depth quickly if you have a narrow bottom width. And you want it at least 13 feet deep. And to consider safety, you should have at least one end as a flatter slope to be able to get out. You can install a flotation device, in case someone falls in the dugout, and you can also fence it off for cattle or wildlife. And if you have visitors over, you might want to have a talk with the children because, sometimes they like to catch frogs around the dugout because the slope of 1.5 to 1 is steep and in a clay with water on the clay, it's very slippery and you wouldn't be able to get out of a dugout with water in on a 1.5 to 1 slope in clay. Sometimes it, might work, but if it's a nicely, constructed dugout, it would be difficult. Now, considering the runoff potential, so now we know the volume of the dugout we need for a 2-year drought supply. Now you want to see if you have the runoff watershed that will fill that dugout 8 out of 10 years. If not, you'll need additional sources or you'll have to reduce the usage or maybe pump from another dugout. So you can determine the area of your watershed to assess the runoff. Go walk around the land, see where the high points are, and calculate the acres that are running off into that dugout. And runoff also, depends on the characteristics of the lands. But this is sort of a ballpark estimation that I'm talking about here. Years ago, I worked in hydrology. I would actually do very specific calculations to determine amount of runoff. So this is just an estimate, a ballpark estimation. I'm going to flip to the map here. We have a map in our quality form dugouts that shows the acres that are required to fill a 1 million imperial gallon dugout. And I just picked, one spot here around your area there. And it shows from this graph that we need from 25 to 50 acres to fill a 1 million imperial gallon dugout. So I'm going to use the average of between 25 and 50, which is 37 acres. So we only need a 0.44 million imperial gallon dugout. So if you multiply those two numbers together, you get that you need 16 acres of catchment area to hopefully fill that dugout. And again, runoff, when I talk to producers, I ask them specific questions about how the runoff is. I won't go through all the questions, but again, this is just a ballpark estimation. A common practice is to construct a dugout in a low area where water sits, but some low areas don't have a lot of water in them. And if you don't need a lot of water, if you're not using a lot of water, then that might be good enough. But generally, if you need more water, you want to select a site that has a good rate of flow for a sufficient period of time. Flow through, so it just doesn't end up sitting in that spot, but flows past in a waterway. Many think that building in wetlands is needed in a time of drought, but there are alternatives in some cases depending on local conditions. A 2 dugout system is a good idea. Your upstream dugout can be the sedimentation dugout that captures sediments that might come into the dugout that carry nutrients that present quality problems. You can do an in situ treatment in that upstream dugout and then transfer the treated water into the second dugout. And when it comes time to clean out the dugout, you can pump the water from the one dugout into the other. Mostly you'd be cleaning out the sedimentation dugout so that you don't waste that water. And agricultural producers normally wait until, the water levels are lower so they don't, lose a lot of water. So here's a schematic of the two dugout system upstream. Here we have our waterway going into a gated culvert, so you can control the flow. I'll talk about that later. And then it goes into our sedimentation dugout, and then it's the treated, if need be, treated water flows into our second dugout where we have our pumping system that goes with the cattle. There's a little bit of a faux pas in this schematic in that you don't want to be digging a pipeline through a waterway to water your cattle. So the cattle would be maybe over here somewhere, but away from the dugouts, so the manure doesn't run off back into the dugouts. As far as the spoil piles go, they should be removed 15 feet from the edge so as to prevent the sloughing of the slopes, but they can also act as a berm to prevent multiple entry points for runoff so that you don't get rills, multiple erosion entry points into the dugout. And then where the water does enter the dugout, where you channeled it into, you can protect that area so it doesn't erode. And also berms can help protect from wind erosion. On larger dugouts, sometimes you can get a fair bit of a wind fetch over the water and they cause waves and can erode the slopes over time. As far as the soils go, you can do soil testing. You can do a simple test, just take a sample, put it in a jar, put water in it, shake it up really good, and let it settle out, and then you can measure the fractions of clay, silt, sand, gravel. So you do want to be digging in fine-grained material, heavy clay, so you don't lose water. You want a low percentage of coarse-grained soils or silt. Silt can be really bad because it can very easily erode and cause slope destabilization. And you want to dig test holes before you dig the dugout, 4 feet deeper than you plan to dig the depth of the dugout. Because if you say you didn't dig test holes, you stopped construction at whatever, 13 feet, say a foot below there's a sand vein, over time water can start seeping through that impermeable layer, and once it gets a tiny opening, it gets larger and larger like a crack in the dam, and then you can lose water out of it. So 4 feet is a healthy depth to dig below than your planned depth, and not just in one spot, in a few spots, because you might miss a sand layer if you just dig one test hole. You want to avoid groundwater dugouts. These are dugouts that are built into an aquifer, whether confined or unconfined, because it has the potential to contaminate the aquifer. And you should consider a shallow well instead, which we call a spring development. And I'll have a schematic of it in a bit here. The depth of, but if you're going to build a groundwater dugout, the depth and size aren't critical because you'll either gain water from the aquifer or lose water. It's the size is not gonna help you much. And it may not be dependable in a time of drought. I was talking with a farmer not too long ago. He had 3 large dugouts, way more than a 2-year drought supply, and he was concerned because the water level was going down and down and down, and he was looking at all the other dugouts that were dry around the area. So as we talked more and more, I determined that they were indeed groundwater fed. And so I told him to monitor the level, and if it kept on getting lower, then he could consider digging a spring development so that he could still access the water even though it was at a lower level. And plus also these groundwater dugouts are open to evaporation, so you're wasting this groundwater that was protected. And also, the contamination potential for the spring. And so here's a schematic of the potential contamination. So let's pretend that your dugout was filled with runoff water, but it's also connected to an aquifer. Basically, if the water level will go down until it reaches a static level, and when that happens, the contaminants, say from livestock or wildlife, can get into the aquifer and contaminate the aquifer. So here's a schematic of for the construction of groundwater dugouts. This is just for the hillside schematic. We also have a low side schematic. It's in our fact sheet called Spring Development. And that will be one of the links that will be sent out to you. So here we see, and this is a nice situation, you don't have to pump it, the water. I guess hopefully this isn't blocking your view, but basically the water, there's a gravel pack around this vertical culvert, and that helps infiltration, and the water then is gravity fed down into a trough. This can get a little tricky here because in winter it can freeze up, but if you're not winter watering, then that's not a problem. As far as excavating equipment goes, track hoes are the most efficient and easier to transport. They can, dig over 60-foot width of a dugout on top. And you can also use crawler tractors or dozers by themselves. They enter and exit out the ends. Generally, the steepest of side slopes, then they build because they're, tilting the sides or 2-to-1, but some operators dig steeper than that. Dozers can also be used in conjunction with track hose to handle the dirt. If you're not just going to dump it into a spoil pile, they can spread it out as you'd like. Scrapers and buggies have been used. They're fast and can haul distances. This is, mainly if you're going to be hauling the fill somewhere else. They're not used very often. As far as liners go, you can use a clay lining. So if you have a lot of clay from the dugout itself, and if you hit a sand or gravel seam, the lining should be from 1.5 to 3 feet thick and packed well. This is costly for the tractor hours, and especially if you have to haul clay in from somewhere else, and then the prices can skyrocket. If you have, some not as a high a percentage of clay, you can add some salt, 20% sodium chloride, to help improve the impermeability of the clay. There are also plastic liners. These are the most common, but they can be punctured. And if you have an aquifer underneath the liner, it can displace the liner. But if you have water, on top of it, that would often hold, that hydraulic pressure from underneath from displacing the liner. You should have a cutoff curtain. So on the edges of the liner, you key them into the soil, so they're not displaced, and so rodents don't get under. And you can put some sand. You see the sand in the picture. There's lines of sand to help keep the liner down. You could even use more than that. And the thicker the liner, the better. I probably should have deleted the word bentonite off here because it's a hit and miss, mostly miss. But if you have a dugout that's leaking water and you know where it's leaking from, which often is difficult to tell, then you can try dumping some bags of bentonite, which is a dry clay that swells when it is in contact with water. And that might be a simple solution. And but yeah, I don't know how often it works. Another method that was used some years ago, I haven't heard it used much recently, but it's called glazation, where you combine 6 inches of straw, a 6 inches thick layer of straw with 6 inches thick layer of clay, and then you compact them together, work it in really well. And over a period of time, this will grow a bioslime that helps improve the impermeability of the clay if you don't have enough clay. The idea is that, if you don't have that much clay, then you can use this. It's more difficult, more work to combine them and pack them together. Now I'll talk about operating systems. Here's a schematic. The top schematic is looking down from above, and there on the bottom is a side view. So on the top schematic, we have a floating intake that's tied on with a rope to a post, so you can pull it out to clean it when need be. You'd have a filter on the end of that intake to prevent, sucking in bugs and floating algae. And you weight it down with then it goes, sorry, that intake goes into a polyethylene intake pipe. Now we'll look at the bottom schematic. Goes into a polyethylene intake pipe that's weighted down with weights, and then it goes out through the side near the bottom of the dugout that you trench, that's tied into a standpipe. In the past, they used to use culverts, larger diameter culverts, and there's no need for that. They corrode and they're harder to install. All you need is a 6-inch to 8-inch PVC well casing. You can install a submersible pump in that, or you can use a jet pump as well above ground in Habitat Shack if you're going to use it in the winter. You should also throw your airline compressor in the trench at the same time, because the condensate from air can freeze and plug the line in winter. I won't go through all the details on the schematic. So you can buy some intakes on, in from stores here and there, but they can get plugged there. You can see in the picture on the left, there's tiny little holes drilled into a PVC pipe. Another is some type of cloth filter, but these can get plugged, and the one of the bottom doesn't have a large intake area. But you can construct your one yourself that's better. From a 5-gallon bucket, you cut holes in the side, affix preferably a wire mesh that's sturdier around the outside, and then you put your fitting through the lid, and that goes ties into your polyethylene line that ties into the wet well. Yeah, I already mentioned the wet wells there. What is not recommended is an intake near the bottom of the dugout. This can be poor quality water and may not be palatable for the animals. By the way, I just want to say that if anyone has questions, they can post them in chat. And I have a slide for a question coming up at the part of the end of part 1 that I'll address any questions if you have them. Also, gravel infiltration trenches. I don't know if people have heard about these, but some people still have been doing them today. Instead of that polyethylene pipe trenching in through the side of the dugout, tying into a wet well, they used to create a trench that they would fill with gravel, where the water would then seep into the wet well. This is not recommended because it can grow slime, and it also can leach hardness and other problems for water quality. Direct watering causes shorter lifespan of the dugout. You can see in this picture, it's a very bad picture. They're punching the sides of the dugout. You can see that water is brown because of all the mud in there and the manure. It increases the nutrients in the dugout, which lends to poor quality water, and cattle health problems, toxins, which can come from blue-green algae, which I'll talk about later, foot rot, stress, cryptosporidium outbreak. If you ever get crypto in a dugout, that catches like wildfire. Livestock safety risks. They can fall through the ice or get stuck in the mud. You can have a loss of storage volume, and also environmental habitat loss. So when we talk about a pumping system, our group calls it an off-source watering system. The idea is that it is to exclude the livestock from the dugout, so the manure water does not run into the dugout. So your watering tank, for example, could be over the crest of the hill. So when the rainfall occurs and runoff occurs, the manure isn't washed back into the dugout, but it's washed downstream, where it hopefully will infiltrate into the land and not end up in a wetland either. As far as stock tanks go, they can be used for winter or summer watering. Pumping systems include solar systems with batteries, because when the sun doesn't shine, then you have storage in batteries, energy storage, and you can also use wind-powered, but you need more storage with wind-powered because sometimes the wind may not blow for a period of time. So the storage can be in batteries and large tanks. You can also have dual solar and wind. This is more expensive, but they complement each other. You can also have gravity-fed pumping systems. well, it's not a pumping system, it's a gravity fed system, so you don't need to spend energy on pumping. However, there you can also include gravity flow reservoirs. So if you have a windmill, for example, these two work well together, you can have a lot of power generated by a windmill. So then you can pump the water up into a reservoir that's in on a like a hill on a higher location. So that you have more storage for the when the wind doesn't blow, and then you just gravity feed out of that elevated reservoir. You can also use nose pumps, which I'll have a picture of here shortly, and pipelines. So if you don't have a good runoff site near where you want your cattle to water, then you can pipe it a longer distance so they don't have to walk so far. And we have a fact sheet called Off-Source Watering Systems for Livestock that will be one of the links that'll be sent to you. For winter watering, you can have a motion detector. So the only when they come to drink, it senses them, and then it pumps water into small bowl, and then when they're done, it drains back into the tank. You can also have low exposure tanks, so there are smaller holes to drink out of. Also, that tank could be mostly inside of a shed or shack that's insulated. You could even put maybe a little heater in there. And only a portion of the tank is peeking outside where the cattle can drink out of. Also, geothermal heat has been used. There's some systems that have deeper buried vertical tanks, and they circulate around so they don't freeze up, and they're insulated at the top where the cattle drink. You should also protect your batteries from cold weather. I don't know if I have a picture of this, but some people have put their batteries in old freezers to protect them from the cold. Also yeah, you can have deep buried lines in winter if further away. You'd have to bury them deeper if you're wanting to below the frost level if you're going to use them in winter. So here's on the top, there's pictures of nose pumps. On the bottom, there's a picture of a solar system, bottom left, and a windmill with tanks there in the bottom right. I don't see any questions in chat. So that was the end of part one. But if you do have any questions, please fire them on. I'm going to start on part two here. And I see we're doing fairly good for time. I try to keep a quick pace here. And so in this part, I'm going to be talking about maintenance, water quality, and treatment, and stocking fish in dugouts. Well, I'm going to be talking about the dugouts for stocking fish. So not so much about the fish themselves, but the dugouts for fish. Over the years, there's a sludge that builds up on the bottom of the dugout, and this is a buildup of nutrients. It contains sediments and dead biological matter, dead bugs, and precipitates from runoff water, dead plants, algae, leaves, manure, etc. And these contain nutrients that promote the growth of algae and blue-green algae. There are different types of algae. There's microscopic algae, which is you can grab it. There's some that you can grab as a mass in your hand that are like weeds. That's what we call algae. And then there's blue-green algae, which if you tried to grab it, it would just be like a slime. And that is actually a bacteria called cyanobacteria. And there's a number of species of cyanobacteria. And also plants. These can fall grow on the sides of the dugout and fall on the sides and the bottom of the dugout. So here we see in our schematic, we have a nice new dugout in the top, but over the years on the bottom, we can see the weeds building up and the floating algae. And over the years, they fall into the bottom sides of the dugout, and you have that build up. And I'll talk about cleaning the dugouts, because every so often it varies on the situation, on the dugout, on the location. It might be every 1 in 10 years, depending on the rate of the buildup, that you may have to clean out the dugout. Tracos are the most common machines used for this. And basically, you're removing the sludge buildup and deeper deposits at the bottom and sides to remove that plant growth. and all the sludge. Sometimes the slopes are sloughed in, so you can sharpen up the slopes at that time as well. So here's a picture of a dugout cleanout. There's a long reach boom on that traco. And you can see the pump laying in the foreground. They've pumped the water out so that basically all that's left is the muck on the bottom of the slides and the sides. And he's already, done some cleanup already. You can see on part of the slopes there, and he's just getting the muck out of the bottom. As far as maintenance goes, you want to regularly inspect your dugout. Check to see, are slopes deteriorating? Are muskrats and cattle causing sloughing or holes in the dugout, or is sloughing occurring? For whatever reason, does the water have color, turbidity, algal, or plant growth? Does it smell? I often do ask producers what the smell is of the water because it can vary depending on what the problem is. Check if your aeration system and pumps and intakes are working, or the buffer areas damaged. That's, the grassed areas that near the dugout that help filter the sediments before they enter the dugout. Proper siting, design, and construction can prevent problems later on. As far as dead animals in the dugout goes, first of all, I do get calls about this every so often. First of all, you have to remove the animal and refrain from using chlorine or bleach. This kills the aquatic life and health of the dugout. You can use a coagulation treatment, which I'll talk about later, to help, precipitate out any harmful bacteria and kill them off, and remove any turbidity out of the dugout. If you're removing an animal, you're going to cause turbidity in the dugout. So now I'm going to be talking about water quality and treatment. An ounce of prevention, as they say, is worth a pound of cure. Use the best management practices to prevent nutrients or other contaminants from entering the dugout in the first place. So you might remember the schematic I showed that had a gated culvert. Sometimes during spring runoff, it can be brown, like, turbid water with a lot of suspended solids in it and dissolved solids as well. So if you get poor quality water, you can shut off the gate, and then when it's better, you can then open the gate. You can also use berms to divert the poor quality water along with the gated culverts. And you can also use weirs. I'm pretty sure I have a slide with a picture here. Basically, a weir will help slow down the water so the sediments fall out of the water before they enter the dugout. Again, I mentioned buffer strips that surround the dugout to help filter out the sediments. You can also use riprap on the slopes to protect against wind erosion and wave erosion, and also where the runoff enters the dugout. You can also use geotextiles. It's such a small area that you could just pick up some geotextile to help prevent erosion. And you shouldn't construct in-stream, as I mentioned before. You should construct off-stream. And I see there's a question. I'll just read it out. I have a client who has a beaver problem. Oh boy, the beaver question. Can they actually contaminate the dugout water? If so, what is the treatment on this? The cattle almost refuse to drink any of the water. Well, yeah, they can cause turbidity. When they chop down. There's another question. Maybe I missed it. Okay, so oh yeah, okay. I'm gonna have to try to check where that Q&A is because I'm only seeing the one tab here. So I'll look for that later.
Can,
Or
can you
maybe
can
if
you hear
Kabir,
me,
if
Sean,
you
right
could
now?
post it in this
Yeah.
chat again so I can see it, because I only see this one question here. So yeah, try to, it's your dugout. I mean, they can produce giardia in the water, but I think the bigger problem is that they cut down trees fall in the dugout, they dissolve, and organic content can get in there. And so a lot of farmers try to remove the beavers, and then you can do a coagulation treatment to reduce the suspended solids and also deal with harmful organisms in the dugout. It's not a surefire thing if there's giardia in there, which there may not be giardia, but that can cause, cattle health problems. And yeah, and then you might need also to clean up the dugout as well. I was just talking with someone the other day that had a beaver problem, and yeah, they just wanted to dig in a whole different area. It can get problematic if they keep coming back, but yeah, so I'll talk about coagulation later on. And if you have follow-up questions, you can always ask them. Um, and there's another question here. Do you have any recommendations, Sean, on the timing of dugout cleanouts during the year? Well, yeah, I mean, you don't want to be cleaning in cold weather, I think, but you want to plan around when you're going to use the water. Often farmers wait till their dugout water is lower. Uh, so if there's been a period of drought, so they don't lose the water. And then they may, I'll keep going here. They may pump from another water source after the clean out to fill the dugout again. But yeah, you want to time it so your cattle are able to use the water, and then maybe after they're done using the water, then you can do a clean out. Because if you clean out a dugout with water in it, you're going to cause turbidity, and then you most likely have to do or should do a coagulation treatment. Another question, is there a reason for using a submersible pump and intake pipe to a well rather than using a floating submersible pump going to a tank above uh, ground, no well? Winter watering is one reason. You can use both, but a lot of farmers do like to use a wet well. Yeah, it's very easy to, throw a pump in overland with the pipe overland into a dugout. So yeah, I mean, it depends on what you can afford at the time, how you want to pump. Some people use these systems portable, so they can move them around from one dugout to another. So yeah, you can use a floating submersible pump as well. It's a matter of preference and management options. Hopefully that answers your question. So this next section is what I call Band-Aid treatments. You weren't able to prevent the problem, so now you need to deal with the problem. You need to, what I call, put a Band-Aid on it to fix the problem. The first most important step to treatment is to identify the problem. A lot of people go and maybe they've heard something on the internet around from other people, and they go throw a bag of something into the dugout. But you really need to know what is the problem, what is the growth, so that you can then select the proper treatment method. And I've seen gross over applications of the wrong product that only does harm and doesn't do any good. I don't think I even want to mention any of the examples that I've heard. But without determining what the problem is, you may be doing more harm than good with the treatment. You need to understand the appropriate treatment for the specific problem. And I'll go through some of the identification. So for example, you need to identify what is growing, if there's a growth of algae or plant or blue-green algae in the dugout. Because some growths are not susceptible to some treatments. Some of the potential problems are blue-green algae growth or cyanobacteria, which I'll talk about later, because that's the worst growth you can have. Aquatic plant growth, algae growth, anoxic conditions, which is low oxygen. This happens when there's a lot of nutrients in the dugout plants or algae to be fed off, and the decomposing bacteria can start feeding on them and suck all the water out of the dugout, and it can become very unpalatable. think I'll be talking about that again in another slide. Sediments and nutrients from runoff are a problem, and dissolved organic content, which comes from those leaves and twigs, etc., these can lead to toxic or unpalatable stinky water. So one of the things you can do is for identification is you can do a water analysis. You don't always need to do a water analysis. I mean, if you phone 310 Farm, we provide assistance with identification. And sometimes it's very obvious what the problem is. Sometimes it's not, and sometimes you may want to know what has caused harm to your cattle, for example. So then, or what might cause harm to your cattle. So I'll be talking about that later on, especially with cyanobacteria or bluegreen algae. So you should clarify the purpose for the analyses and then focus, what to test for. You can get, as far as the chemical analyses go, you can get standard or special suites based on what you think the problem is. And if you phone 310 Farm, we can help reason through that with you. As far as the biological side goes, you can identify the species. This is most important for blue-green algae. You can get a cell count, and I say they're toxins, but really in Alberta now we only test for one toxin, and that's variants of the microcystin toxin. There are other toxins that have grown in other countries, but if the climate changes, it gets hotter, we may see some of those toxins growing here in the future as well that we may need to have tests for. Also, you can test for fecal coliforms. Well, there's probably going to be fecal coliforms in the dugout, but you might want to know the level in some cases. And less common, you could test for Cryptosporidium or Giardia. There's a few cases that might happen, but they're few and far between of those. We have you can do a suitability assessment. So who's using the water? What are you using the water for? May not even be an animal. You might be watering your garden. But we have a suitability assessment tool called the Rural Water Quality Information Tool online, and that's one of the links that will be sent to you to determine the chemistry suitability for a particular usage. We do have some comments on biology. We also have suites. Well, that's one of the bullets there down further. We have suites of tests that you can get done from the labs. And sometimes the labs will have slightly different types of suites that you can ask them, based on your focus, what suite you would choose. This tool deals with the common contaminants and other parameters for livestock. It doesn't deal with every contaminant for livestock because there's a lot that one could test for, and there's a lot of parameters that could cause problems. But these are the most common problem contaminants that we use in the tool. And there is also a treatment information link. This is an old bullet. Unfortunately, when we moved our government website to a new format, we lost some of that information, but it's a little harder to find, but there's still a lot of good fact sheets available through that tool on treatment. So there's a lot of useful and valuable information in that link, but you might have to search around a bit more. Here's a picture of it. There's the sampling testing information link, what you can test for, treatment information, key features, how to use the tool, and then you have to accept the disclaimer to use the tool. That's what it looks like. It was made for dial-up speed back in the day so that everyone could use it. So it does work better than some other websites. May not be too pretty because we designed it that way, but it's functional. And here's a print screen of the chemical parameters for livestock. Once you select livestock, then you'll select, say, cattle and horses or other swine, poultry, etc. So here you can see some of the parameters. You do have to enter a parameter for TDS or total dissolved solids in order to progress through the tool, because that's one of the main parameters assessed. Here's a example of just one of the pages of the report that you can print out into PDF or on paper. And the reason I print screen this is because it shows the legend. So if it's green circle, it's good to use. If it's yellow, it's um, without a black around it. It's within 80% of the federal guidelines. Sometimes there are not guidelines for some of the parameters, so then we have a black box around the stop sign symbol. And this is designed even for colorblind people based on symbol. And then if it's red without a black box around it, it exceeds the federal guideline. And if there's no federal guideline, it's based on, we have information based on best available information. So we still provide information because people have questions about that. When there is no guideline, we still provide information for it. So now with plant and algae identification, again, this is an important thing to do when you're trying to address a problem in your dugout. You need to know what is growing in the dugout in order to treat it. There's guides from the federal government and the Alberta Lake Management Society on plant and algae identification that I use. I believe I've included those in the links. I think so, yeah. And so there are submergent and partly submerged vegetation such as Cara, which is fully submerged, Hydrilla, fully submerged, duckweed is partly submerged. Sure, everyone's familiar with duckweed in the schematic in the bottom right. The reason they call it partly submerged is because this green petal floats on top, whereas the root hair sinks down into the water, so it's partly submerged. You also have your emergent rooted vegetation, such as cattails and bulrush, and floated rooted vegetation in Alberta, which is water lilies, not very common. Now, for the most important part of identification is you want to know if you have blue-green algae growing in your dugout. Again, this is actually bacteria called cyanobacteria. Cyan means blue-green color, although it can be different colors. It can be cyan, it can be green, red, brown, pink. The list doesn't really stop there, but those are the most common ones. By the way, a lot of people use BGA for blue-green algae, or harmful algal blooms is another acronym, HAB, if you ever see it on the internet. Many species of this bacteria exist. Common appearances can be a green pea soup appearance, a grass clipping appearance. Some people think that they were mowing around the dugout and grass clippings got into the dugout, but it can actually be a phenomenon, which I'll have a picture of later. It can also have a globular appearance, but if you grab that glob, it'll break up like a slime, easily break up like a slime in your hands. So this is a test that you can do. If you wear rubber gloves, if you get a sample, be careful you don't fall into the dugout. Get a sample, and if you can grab it as like a weed in your hands, it's not blue-green algae. But if it's like a slime, it could be, and often most likely is blue-green algae because it's very common in a lot of dugouts. Sometimes you can have other growths like diatoms that can look slimy. You can discuss the identification with a specialist such as myself. Call 310 farm, ask to speak to a water specialist. You can test for the cell identification in a lab, phone a private lab. You check the yellow pages if you want to find one. You can test for the microcystin toxins, as I mentioned. So you can check what level it is. I mean, if there's toxins, you always want to be cautious. And I'll talk about that a little later. Percentage of them produce liver or nerve toxins and can cause organ damage or death if enough is ingested. And, sign of that an animal, let's say a beef cow, has ingested cyanobacteria. If they're dead right at the edge of the dugout, I mean, you got to be thinking that might be cyanobacteria. Here's some pictures of microcystis or anabina. Both could look like this. This is the green pea soup appearance. But as you can see in the picture here, there's this cyan color here. Some of this is sort of caked off, dried up, died off. Even at this stage, by the way, if the wind has blown the cyanobacteria onto the shores of the dugout, the toxins can remain viable in those cells, even if they're dead for, more than a month afterwards. So it should, you got to be have to be cautious with that. Yeah, so it's always nice. I don't like to flip past these slides too often because I often stop and look at them. But there's other types of, filamentous algae growing in there as well. Here's a Phanozomenon, which I mentioned. This is a heavy growth. I should have probably chosen a picture that wasn't such a heavy growth, because you can see the grass clipping type of appearance. Sometimes it just looks like this in the dugout. And it's this, but yeah, this is really clumping together. All these grass clippings and it's very heavy. It doesn't often look like that, but I like these types of pictures as well. Here's an interesting growth. It doesn't happen in a lot of dugouts. I just wanted to include it because it's a beautiful picture of Planktothrix. This can grow in low light conditions, can be in a lake even before the ice comes off and then be revealed once the ice melts. This is a picture of Lake Muriel with Planktothrix in it. Here's an interesting growth that happened in dugouts nearby me. I went and traveled to this dugout, and this is Euglena sanguinea. This is not cyanobacteria, but I found out that it can bear toxins. So if you see it in your dugout, you need to be careful. When we first came, I'll show a close-up of this picture, but it sort of looks like cyanobacteria here, but it isn't. And it looks different when you get up closer as well, but it has a brighter lime green than cyanobacteria has. When I first came to the dugout, it had this green color. And then the second time I came, the farmer phoned me again, and he thought someone dumped red paint into his dugout. But this Euglena sanguinea has the ability under high intense ultraviolet light to change into a red color to protect itself from the intense ultraviolet light. So it's quite a fascinating creature. It's a protist. It can gain or get energy from both the sunlight, as well as it can envelop organisms and digest them to get energy as well, which is quite fascinating. Here's a close-up, and you can see it sort of looks like a hydrophobic growth, water repelling growth, and it is floating on top of the dugout. It has sort of a dryish sort of feel to it. It again, it can bear toxins, so you should have rubber gloves on if you ever see it. And it has a fish-like smell as well. But there's swimmers. They have a flagella, so there's swimmers underneath this floating layer as well that they're swimming in the water. Okay, moving on to aeration. A membrane diffuser is the best. These create tiny bubbles so that these tiny bubbles have a better chance of diffusing into the water, so they become dissolved oxygen, part of the water itself, and not just float to the surface and be wasted. Air is O2, oxygen. It's an oxidant that helps oxidize nutrients. It's not a magic bullet. It's not a save-all, but it does promote better quality water. And in this picture here, there are two membranes. If you have to have these two membranes on the same water line, but they were separated from each other, one was higher than the other, almost all the air would be coming out of the higher one because of hydraulic pressure. So bear that in mind when you're installing these membrane diffusers. They should be at the same level. Here's a side view, cross section of an aeration, half the dugout and an aeration system. You have your diffuser at the bottom, so it's creating a column of bubbles that are rising to the top, but then it creates this circulation in the water that helps to expose most of the water in the dugout to the air so that, it's not just being aerated in one spot. Okay, now I want to talk about treatment of blue-green algae or cyanobacteria with copper products. I tried to avoid the use of copper and steer people away from it with other treatments and practices, because copper is toxic to living organisms. Most granular forms of bluestone, uh, these are older forms called copper sulfate. They're granular. Most of them are not registered under the Pest Management Regulatory Association anymore of Health Canada. But there is still one granular product, last I checked, that is available through the Federated Co-op. And I have the product number if you are interested. But there are liquid copper forms that are available now that are registered, and there are chelated forms that uh, have more efficacy in the treatment. So you use less copper to achieve the same or better results. They stay in the water column longer as well, making it more effective. So you can do with copper, if you're going to treat with copper, you can do spot treatments to reduce the amount of copper. So if the wind has blown the blue-green algae into one spot along the shore or one line along the shore, you can do spot treatments and try it more than once, until you kill them off. Or you can do a treatment of the whole top 1 meter of the dugout, which is less than treatment for the whole dugout itself. Copper will, if you're spraying the liquid copper like in water, diluted in water over the dugout, it will fall down in the water column eventually and end up, then treating the water throughout. So you might want to start off with smaller amounts of treatment. But I've seen it very grossly over applied, and it just shudders sometimes of the stories I hear. And it's also applied on the wrong growth. So again, you need to identify the species. Copper, I would only say if people are bent on using it, should be applied only to blue-green algae. The copper will break open the cells of the blue-green algae, releasing the toxins all at once. So the cattle should be removed for at least 3 weeks. I've heard stories where they've treated with copper, and within 3 weeks, so what happens when you treat with copper, it kills the cells and releases the nutrients from those cells back into the water column. And in some stories, within 3 weeks, it's regrown. The blue-green algae has grown again. So it's a losing battle. That doesn't happen in all cases. Most cases, it'll kill off the blue-green algae for a period of time, maybe next season. And so then once these cells are broken open, the toxins are released, the ultraviolet light will degrade the toxins over a quicker period of time. The names of these liquid copper products are Kutin Plus, Algae Boss, Polydex, Think Purity. I'm just going to check chat. No, there's no more questions. So I'll continue. So here's a better treatment that you can use for cyanobacteria or blue-green algae is a coagulation treatment. You can use hydrated lime or aluminum sulfate. Hydrated lime, I'll be talking about this later on, probably, is is more toxic than aluminum sulfate. If there's one coagulation treatment you'd use, it would be aluminum sulfate because it handles more situations. And I'm just going to respond to some questions here. I'll read them out. How many aerators are recommended based on the size of a dugout? That's a good question. Basically, I could help you. I have a calculator for that. I'm not going to give a over general answer, but you can phone 310 Farm Master, speak to water specialists, and then we can help you based on the volume of your dugout and the size of your dugout configuration on, how many aerators to put on your dugout and the flow of air that you would need for that volume of dugout. So it's not something that I can specifically answer right now. I'll just read the second question. Are there certain sizes of aerators people should get depending on the size of your dugout. Yeah, so same answer. So if you want to phone 310 Farm, ask to speak to a water specialist, we can address your specific dugout. Excuse me. So uh, back to coagulation. So these coagulants lock cells away while they drag the cells down to the bottom of the dugout, inside the dugout, where they slowly degrade on the bottom. It takes longer than the copper does that releases toxins, and then the UV breaks the toxins down. If there's some turbulence in the dugout, like a runoff curves, it could reinitialize some of that into the water column. But based on the studies I've seen, I don't think it's a big problem. Um, there's maybe not a whole lot of data, but it could be the one treatment that you do, or you could do a two-stage treatment, do a copper treatment, and then follow up with a coagulation to help remove the nutrients, because the coagulation treatments help remove the nutrients. I might be covering this in slides later on, but in case I don't, I might as well say it now. Hydrated aluminum sulfate is better for dissolved organic content, like from dissolved leaves and whatnot, or runoff from a field that has more or dissolved organic content. And hydrated lime is better for suspended solids. But again, aluminum sulfate would be the one coagulation treatment if you're only going to use one. Yeah. So now I was talking about blue-green algae, which is this like a slime, but filamentous algae. And when I say filamentous algae, I mean an algae that is like something you can grab like a mass in your hand. I just want to check. Can I just get a check to see if people can still see me and hear me? Because I can't see myself and I'm wondering if something happened. Could someone type in chat? Okay, thank you. On a webinar, sometimes when I tell a joke, no one laughs. I feel slighted. But yeah, webinar certainly is different than in person. But so back to the filamentous algae that is like a weed that you can grab as a mass in your hand. Many algae are resistant to copper. You can use hydrated lime to reduce the nutrients and directly kill the algae as well. But you need to identify it in order to prescribe the proper treatment. So I'll talk about coagulants here. Um, the and these are main coagulants. There are other coagulants as well, but these I mentioned hydrated lime or aluminum sulfate. But there's also ferric chloride and ferric sulfate, which can be quite effective, but they're not really out in the marketplace and not well known. We have some fact sheets. The federal government has made fact sheets on it. That group has gone by the wayside. They used to be called Prairie Farm Rehabilitation Administration, PFRA. Fortunately, they went by the wayside, but we do have information on that, but I think it's a little harder to get a hold of and apply. And you should get a water analysis to be effective and to determine the amount of coagulant product needed. And they're different. I mean, you can call 310 Farm for more information on that. That's a bit detailed. They are labor intensive. And so here you can see in the picture, this you should be fully garbed in personal protection equipment. He has, the whole suit on, gloves, and I'm pretty sure something for his face. You don't want to be, if you dump a bag of powder into, this mixing barrel and the dust comes up into your face, that's not good, especially hydrated lime is caustic. And and yeah, you can see these guys are fully garbed, but actually all the farmers need are their ball caps, as you can see in the picture. I'm waiting to see if someone posts an LOL in chat. But there is a guy, yeah, he's a wider brim hat, but there's a guy in a muscle shirt here as well. Maybe he was in the wrong presentation. So the application of coagulants, I mentioned you have to use proper gear, safety practices. Some are more caustic than others. You can hire a contractor to do it in season. We used to have two contractors in the province. Now, I think There are none left. So I might have to delete that bullet, but it's been a while. I know one person has retired, unfortunately. And again, to remind you, each coagulant has its strengths and weaknesses. You can also use colorants to block basically a dye that blocks the ultraviolet light, inhibiting the aquatic plant growth. It's not a magic bullet, but it does help. I've heard, you know, anecdotal stories that it's been fairly effective. So you apply it before the growth season, like in spring after runoff, and then before the growth season. You could wait a little further after spring. However, this year I've already had blue green algae calls. I don't forget, more than a week ago. So you might want to do it earlier than later. It's one of the earliest that I've remembered, having blue-green algae grow. If you applied it and then you have a runoff, you may need to add, throw in another packet later on. Essentially, a lot of them just come in packets in a dissolvable baggie. Do not open that baggie unless you want to join the Blue Man group. You just throw the packet into the dugout and the packet dissolves, and then the dye will dissolve into the dugout. And Aqua Shade and Wavex are examples. I'm just checking my time. Over an hour and a half in. I should be able to finish. As far as aquatic herbicides, these are contact herbicides. They're effective on many submergent and emergent aquatic plants, but they're not effective on most types of algae. You have to make sure that products are approved for use in Canada. Uh, and but if you were to remove the plants if you burn them with herbicides, they're going to fall back into the water and release nutrients into the water for a regrowth of hopefully something not worse like blue-green algae. But if you remove harvest the plants and take them away, then you're removing the nutrients out of the water or preventing them from going back into the water and producing a growth of something again, or something worse. The commercial brands are called Reglone A and Reward. I have a fact sheet on Reward. If anyone's interested, they can call me. I don't know if I've included that in a link because I don't think I would, but it might be in one of the links that will be sent to you. There are no magic bullets. Some products for sale may not work in many situations, even though they have glowing testimonials. We have had calls over the years, and we have to, try to give a explanation of why we don't recommend some of these products. May not be because they don't work. Sometimes it might just because there's not enough data or results, that we've seen. You have to gather information first to make an informed decision. And I often ask producers a number of questions before I give them a recommendation. Okay, moving on to dugouts for stocking fish. They can't be in a waterway where fish can escape. You may have to install a screen to reduce the risk of escape. And we have an alberta.ca website for fish culture licenses that I'm pretty sure is one of the links. Hopefully that will be sent to you. I have the site, and you can always just search for it also. But you can go through a fish dealer who will guide you through the process as well. That would be the best. And here, there's just I don't expect you to read this. This is the site where if you search for that fish culture license, it would be the recreational one, not the commercial one. As far as the water quality goes, dissolved oxygen is the most important parameter. You should monitor frequently. It depends on the dugout. You should actually get a dissolved oxygen meter, because you should be testing often. Aeration is necessary and it must be constant. So, connected to the power grid, not a windmill. You could make a solar system work if you're away from the grid. But you want to have constant aeration, because if the aeration stops, and the oxygen level goes down, it takes a long time to bring the oxygen level back up. And make sure that this aeration system is running well ahead of time before you stock fish in the dugout. Test your dissolved oxygen as well before you put fish in. If you run into an emergency with low oxygen, you could use a pump and spray the water into the air. It's not advised. I mean, it's not efficient and it causes more evaporation. But if it's an emergency, that's one thing you can do. If some fish are dead that you notice, it's likely there are more dead that you haven't seen. Hotter weather will reduce the dissolved oxygen concentration. Water is sort of like a sponge. The hotter it gets, the less oxygen it can absorb. But you may have to stop feeding the fish for a while, and to reduce their metabolism, and so their oxygen requirements are less as well. I'm sure you've heard of when there's angler restrictions put on during hot weather. That's because of the low dissolved oxygen conditions and the heat also. So when you're putting fish into the dugout, you can slowly add pond water into where they're being stored before you put it into the dugout to slowly acclimatize them before you put them right into the pond if there's a big difference. And by the way, thanks, Dave, for laughing there in chat. Um, uh, Continuing with water quality, some dugouts may have high salinity. This can be a big problem. I don't know if you heard about all the animals that died in Saskatchewan one time with high salinity. There was a problem with the well water, and they started watering from a dugout that was a seeping area that went through media that had high salinity in it, and a number of cattle died because of high salinity. Polioencephalitis that caused swelling of the brain, but it was very high levels. I'm just going to address this question. How to do water sampling for quality testing in a dugout? Is reaching to different depths important for good results? Yeah, good question. Like if when people do studies on the dugout, on the water body, they take it from different levels. But you could just take one sample from where your intake is, because that's where the water is coming from. You might want to sample if it depends on what the issue is, what you're trying to focus on. You might want to take one near the bottom of the dugout if you're thinking about the health of the dugout, for example. But yeah, it depends on what your problem you feel you need to address. And you can always phone 310 Farm and ask to speak to water specialists to, to reason through that process. But normally it would just be near the intake, one sample. So you can get these, you have to get them done at a private lab. There's no free testing for this. You can purchase your own kits to monitor regularly for multiple parameters such as temperature, dissolved oxygen, pH, and salinity. As far as maintenance goes, you have to maintain the dugout to keep acceptable conditions. Again, that sludge, if it builds up, in plant growth, you can get a lot of nutrients in the dugout, especially if you're feeding the fish. Things can grow in there, so you may need to clean out that dugout, the sludge layer, every so often. So you remove your fish and then clean the dugout. You can use general maintenance practices, but special considerations must be made. So if your people have used copper, but it would have to be a reduced amount of copper so it doesn't harm the fish. And I would try to keep away from copper, is even more so for that reason. Yeah, so for fish, I just mentioned you can reduce the amount of copper used. If you kill vegetation during a treatment to the dugout, decomposing bacteria can start feeding on that vegetation, and then this can suck all the oxygen out of the dugout very quickly, and it can lead to fish kills. A lot of fish can be killed in a short period of time if that's the case. If duckweed covers the entire surface of the dugout, oxygen levels can also be depleted. So, if you can scrape the duckweed off, remove it from the dugout, that would be the best. I do have a fact sheet on water quality for fish. I don't know if it's available on the website anymore. I don't think it is. So you can always phone 310 Farm if you have questions about it. So this fact sheet is the target quality that you're looking for. Yeah, and I mentioned some of those other points already. As far as the design for stocking, the dugout for stocking fish, the deeper the better, the minimum 15 feet deep. You want to prevent predators such as bird, fish, and mammals from eating the fish. I believe there's a fact sheet I have in a link on that subject, how to deal with predators for fish. So I won't go into details. And this might sound a little crass, but depending on how many, because you can spend a lot of money on controlling predator control and how to deal with it, but it might depend on how many fish you're losing as to how much you spend on control. And yeah, I mentioned the fact sheet there that should be in one of the links. And here's the take-home message, short and sweet. Remember, proper siting, design, and construction can prevent problems later on. And here are the references that should be sent to you. I didn't mention the Alberta Wetland Classification System link, but if you're interested in that, you can look at that. I'll just go on to the next slide. I'll just let you peruse a little bit. Yeah, all of the links that I mentioned are included in here. And we have a lot of other good fact sheets as well. So that is the end. If anyone has any further questions, thanks to you. Thank you for the questions so far. They were good questions.
Can you hear me now,
And
Sean?
sorry, Kabir, because
No?
I think I
Okay.
will nod
Okay,
your head
I
if
will.
I will
Okay,
say
I
thank
will.
you and
Yeah,
because I can't hear you,
yeah.
unfortunately.
I will type everything in the
I'll just read what
Q&A. Yeah.
Kabir posted.
There's a sh
Share. Okay, are you going to share the slide point with us as well for hyperlinks? No, I won't share the PowerPoint slides. Kabir, maybe you can
Yeah.
post in chat. Ca- this I noticed there was a notification that it might be recorded. Will
Yeah.
there be a temporary
So
availability of the
so
recording for a period of time? I
yeah.
I don't want it to be. I only would want it to be for the registrants, and only for a short period of time, like maybe a week or two. They wanted to refresh something. Kabir is typing. Okay, for how long? Well, we can talk about that later. Yeah. Okay. So yeah, and thank you again, Kabir, for hosting this and organizing this. I appreciate it. Great job that you did here setting this up. Okay, very good. I'll maybe hang on just for a tiny little bit to see if there's any further questions, but I'll let Kabir call it when he feels he's ready. Okay, you're welcome. And thanks, Dave. You were the only one that laughed at my joke.
Are there any more questions? I guess no questions.
Okay, thank you again, Kabir. I'll
Yeah,
stop sharing and leave the meeting. Everyone have a good day.
yeah. Thank you so much, Sean, for giving us your time, and I hope everybody found it very. Yeah, it was excellent pleasure, and it was a pleasure to have you with us today. That brings an end to our webinar. Thank you all for attending, and we hope everybody found the presentation